Howdy, this is the second of 3 videos on incident response, and I will try to keep it to a more constrained time limit. We're going to talk a little bit about the team. And obviously it's an essential step in the preparation process. Let's say you're in your job, you got your job coming out of A&M, it's your dream job, and they ask you to put together a plan for incident response, right? So you need that group of people that prepares for and responds to any emergency incident. Let me give you a little advice here. You have 2 kinds of people on that team that are going to have directly conflicting goals. You are going to have people on that team who are going to try to keep the systems operational. That's their job, that's their mission. They realize that any good company depends on cash coming in the door, which means products and services goes out the door. So they're going to be focused on keeping it operational. A second kind of person you're going to have on that team are your cyber people, who are there to protect, okay? And they're going to be more concerned about stopping the attack and protecting. So you're going to not only have a team with various roles and functions. I'm giving you just 2 highlights of people I've seen come in conflict with, like, I know the house is on fire, but we got to keep going kind of thing, which no, we have to stop everything and put the fire out. So you have to understand you're going to have different people. You are going to have conflict because they have different missions. They have different goals, they have different skills, they have different training. So they're trained and prepared for their roles. And this is why you want to do tabletop exercises. And sometimes it's just to get, okay, now I understand why that job's going to be done and who's going to do it, okay? May not agree with it when the house is on fire, but now I understand. Communication is key. And when it says here that teams are frequently dynamic, size to the scale, nature of the incident, the scope, all of this. And obviously you got to have a team. You got to have training. You got to treat them like valuable team members. Any kind of incident I've ever been in, emotions are going to run high. People are going to get snappy. Things are going to be said. Years ago, when I started my first company, I did what I called MBA Light, a professional development course at Rice, which required me to drive down from College Station 1 or 2 days a week for a semester. And that's before they had the 290, when you still had to go through Waller and Hempstead. That's how many years ago that was. And it was very interesting because there were 30 people in the class, and they did this testing, and they discovered that under an emergency or an incident, I became more nurturing than I typically am. And the person there said this was wrong. And I said, and basically said that, no, you shouldn't be more nurturing. You should be more dictatorial. You should be this, would be that. I said, you don't understand where I work. I work with a bunch of mostly male engineers, computer scientists focused on their thing. If there's an emergency, if there's an incident, if there's a proposal that we have to spend all night doing when people aren't sleeping, if something bad has happened, and we've had incidents that we had to respond to, my goal was to keep everybody calm, okay? I'm less nurturing in everyday life. No, he was wrong. I was not wrong. My goal during the emergency was to be the center pole of the tent that held it together. And I understood that job. I was good at that job. Then when the incident was over, I went back to being, my demanding and nurturing self, whatever. But he's right. In times of emergency, there is a leader that has to take, and you have to focus on the mission. There have been incidents after incidents of plane crashes where the pilot or co-pilot became more focused on the people in the back or hearing babies cry or something and overlooked critical data. They're not doing their job. Their job is to land that plane. There was an incident, 20-some years ago. The plane actually had to burn off fuel to make an emergency landing, and the pilot, the last recordings of the pilot was he was so concerned about what was going on back in the cabin that they actually ran out of gas and crashed and killed everyone anyway, okay? So you have to know your job. You have to know the role you play technically, and then your personality comes into it, okay? So when you talk about an incident response team, you can't train somebody to be more nurturing or less nurturing. You can train people to help in communication, to understand there's different modes of communication. I'm the type of person, if I'm in a meeting and we leave without a to-do list and without dates and without a plan, I'm upset. I may not realize I'm upset, but I'm upset. I've sat with people who are visionaries. You can have a 3-hour meeting and they set out the scope and this great idea, but there's no plan in place. And so when I'm saying, what's our next step? What are we going to do? How's this? How's that? they're upset. And then later on, when other people take their plan and run with it, sometimes they're like, wait a minute, that was my plan. But there's all these different modes of communication. That's who we are. That's our personalities. That's what makes it unique. That's what makes the world go round. Although sometimes I think it goes around better than other times. So data requires protection, womb to tomb. He's got in storage, in transit, during processing. I say in creation, in storage, in transit, during processing, and destruction. What happened to computers in Harvey that were ruined and set out on the curb? And you say, oh, well, they're ruined. They were set out on the curb. Well, we know from 20 or 30 years ago that there's no such thing as a hard drive that can't be brought back from the dead, okay? So the level of risk during creation, storage, transit, processing, destruction, recovery, business continuity, disaster recovery, it differs. Time, quality, and access, okay? And this is where you're going to get the conflict. Somebody's going to be saying, wait, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to protect the media. They're going to be looking at their aspect. Now, you know, the primary thing you do is you try to minimize what's going on. So you try to minimize, can I keep the doors operational and keep the data minimization? So I've put the data minimization throughout my protect and defend, but now that I'm in the incident response, is there some way, and this is business continuity and incident response, that I can keep going? So there's two aspects of this data minimization. What he says here is true. Don't keep what you don't need, right? Think of all the information I could keep on you. Is it important to me as your teacher to know your height, your weight, where you went to elementary school, your dog's name, your best friend, you know, what you do in your hobbies? No, why would I even keep that? Okay, well, it's kind of the same thing. You'll see people, I've seen databases where it'll have historical data that they no longer need, and they're still keeping this data updated, and it'll be like, why are you tracking this? It's not important. Minimize the data. And at the same time, when you're up and trying to keep things operational, try to keep those minimal functions and the most critical things going. So he defines an incident as a situation that departs from normal routine operations. As I said, NIST, strictly speaking, defines an incident as a violation of security policy. Okay? Doesn't matter how, as long as you, which definition you adhere to, as long as you understand that there are two definitions and why the definitions are coming from. NIST is saying when you go back and do your post-mortem analysis, you need to know the policy violations that led to that incident, okay? It's not the day the centrifuges in the nuclear site blew up. So it's got to be detected, and many times it's detected because bad things happen. You know, you go to use your credit card and you find out it's past its limit because someone has stolen your number, and you call MasterCard and say, hey, what's going on? Or MasterCard has detected it, right? But there's that detection, but again, you have to know when the event started if you're part of that emergency response team, because you got to go back to the causes and make sure the root causes have been fixed. So you do an incident like anything else, you're going to keep a database. When was it reported? Who reported it? What it was? When? Hardware, software involved. You begin this traceability. You do it both to do your analysis and your incident response as well as your post-mortem analysis. It's like the last person you want to see come in, you know, or the Channel 6 news people or the Wall Street Journal reporters or something like this to do the post-mortem, right? The second last people you want to see are the lawyers who come in and say, well, why did you make this decision at that time, right? Because they're worried about defending the company from liability. So we've got an information security program in place. Your initial response has to be aligned with that, which is typically where you get the conflict, because your initial business practices is keep the doors open. You know, Target didn't say, hey, we got to fix this, close the doors. Target said, hey, we have to fix this, but while we're even figuring out how many records were stolen and exactly what happened, 10% off everything in the store, right? 10% off everything in the store because we got to keep the doors open, right? So the initial response have to be redesigned to comply with administrative legal policies and the like, and information has to be accurate. And as a cyber first responder, you're charged with doing as much as you can to control the damage and loss of evidence. When I talk about ethics, occasionally I do a 481 or 681 lecture here at A&M. I always bring up the case about the engineer at BP who was not at all involved in Deepwater Horizon, had nothing to do with it, wasn't even close to it, wasn't even part of the real process to figure out how much oil was going out into the ocean every day as they attempted to stop it. But he and his boss were texting, and he deleted text, and he was charged. The first time, the criminal was a hung jury, I believe. The second time, he pled out. In the meantime, they took his passport because he was married to an international woman. They were afraid he might flee. BP did not pay his legal bills. I'm guessing he probably paid $400,000 or $500,000 out of pocket. And all he did was delete text. But the fact of the matter is, there had been a litigation hold put in place. I don't know the whole facts. He said the texts were all backed up on email. I don't know. I don't care, because at the end of the day, he ends up losing his job, losing a couple of years of his life, and being put in financial straits, right? Because of preservation of evidence. And all he was doing was conjecturing how much oil could possibly be coming out based on an engineering analysis, right? So the same thing happens. You are trying to stop the house on fire, and at the same time, you got to worry about keeping evidence. Because we have a lot of regulatory agencies, right? If you're talking a cybersecurity attack, if it's a national security incident, there's regulatory agencies, and then there's many more investigative agencies, right? Depending on what it is. If it's involves the Treasury Department, you can have the Secret Service. Who knew they did cybercrime, right? But they're part of the Treasury Department. You're going to have banking regulators. You're going to have state regulators. You're going to have all this people, all their investigations. Sometimes redundancy, you got to deal with it, right? So you identify the incident, you characterize the incident, you decide how you can isolate it from spreading, and you try to analyze, perhaps, is it on this kind of machine, this operating system? Are there other parts of my company that could be vulnerable? And you basically want to contain it and get rid of it. Contain it, eradicate it, okay? Contain it and eradicate it. And this is how do you isolate it? How do you contain it? When Shamoon hit the Aramco computers, which is still the largest attack against a commercial entity in history in cyber attacks, mainly because Saudi Aramco, the state-owned oil company, is something like 10 times the size or something of ExxonMobil. It's the biggest corporation in the world. They had 30,000 affected machines. They couldn't contain it. They could not contain it, so they took the machines out in the desert and destroyed them. And the good news is some sales guy was sitting somewhere and said, hey, I've got a big order for you. The bad news was we need 30,000 machines and we need them today, right? So when they talk about containment, it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, we've got it stopped, machines clean, let's go on. Suddenly you might be looking at replacing. Now think about this. Even if it's 3,000 machines or 300 machines, you've got to do setup, you've got to reinstall, or somebody does. You have to get all this stuff back up operational. Every single day Saudi Aramco was stopped, they were losing millions of dollars. It's a good attack to study Shamoon, because we are all feeling the effects today, because they attributed the attack to Iran, and I always get the Shiite Shia things mixed up, and it doesn't matter, but it was conflicting religious groups. They attributed the attack to Iran, so one of the reasons they flooded the worldwide market with oil, which drove the price down and put Texas oil and gas into some pain a few years ago, was to try to drive the Iranian economy under, right? So there's an unintended consequence, right? So my point is, just because you're isolating this and containing it, your best mode of containment may be pulling cables, turning machines off. We're dead. We're dead in the water. We have to rebuild. Now, what was interesting is I talked to someone, I was working oil and gas later after Shamoon hit, not during the time of Shamoon, and I was talking to someone who said other companies, let's say in Houston, big international companies that were connected to Saudi Aramco, it's the biggest oil company in the world, went into the machine room and basically were pulling cables. They were not sure wondered if they were under attack. Nobody knew what was going on. So they began to treat this incident and saying, we need to disconnect from the internet ourselves until we can figure out if we've been compromised. I don't know if it's true. I should check this sometime, but one report I read was the last image on the 30,000 computers before they went down was a burning US flag. So it was definitely a nation state attack. It was definitely targeted to undermine the Saudi economy, and it definitely had long range consequences beyond just the lessons learned. Okay, So we isolate the incident, we irradiate the problem, we quarantine, we can do all this stuff. But again, I want you to think on the granular level of the servers and laptops and like, and then I want you to go back up and think of the system and the corporate level. We go back to that NIST. We have the IT structure, we have the business processes. Above that, we have the C-suite, we have the business goals, we have the business processes, and then we have where it gets down to the nuts and bolts and eventually the zeros and ones, right? So when we talk about that system and that response, we're working across all levels. So I'm going to go through these quickly because this is otherwise going to be a longer chapter than I wanted. Everything depends on strategy. Everything depends on planning. How important were the, or critical, let's use that word, are the impacted systems? How sensitive was the data? What's the potential overall dollar loss? What are the consequences? Hello, can we think of any unintended consequences that might happen? How much downtime can be tolerated? Obviously, the Shamoon and Saudi Aramco, it wasn't 2 or 3 weeks before they came back up. Maersk, it took them weeks to come back up fully. I'm going to try to find a written document on the Maersk case study because I haven't been able to find it yet. But I did go to a presentation that was public, so I know the information I can disclose from what I heard. Maersk did something very smart. They were supposed to be upgrading to Windows 10 later that fall, and instead they prioritized the ports that had to come up. #1 port in the world that they needed to bring up was Rotterdam. Houston was on that top list. But then they said, okay, but you know, it's going to take us longer now, but we're going to go on and do our critical systems upgrade to Windows 10. So we're going to accelerate that timeline, although our overall recovery for the ransomware attack is going to take longer. They made some strategic business decisions. They also, Maersk got out ahead of it and went public. This is what's happened, okay? They maybe did some wrong things, but all in all, I think they did a pretty good job. So when we do this strategy, we're talking about the downtime to be tolerated, who are the perps, the perpetrators, what's the skill level of the attacker? Does it have an adverse publicity potential? Is there a reputation risk? Does this seem to be part of a larger nation-state attack? You know, what's the strategy here? So we need to consider all that. There is a NIST book a guidebook on incident response, and I will find that and put that in the next video. Now we get all that done, we get all this information I just gave you, and then we get to the investigation part. You know, if you follow the BP, April 2010, they were predicting that would stay the investigations through courts for at least a decade. BP made a smart business decision. They just anteed up the money. Halliburton, there were some others involved. Transocean, I can't remember who all was involved. Schlumberger was not involved, but was there on site. But there were, you know, the oil and gas is a very complicated supplier chain. So they all had some part to play in the investigation. But BP rightfully said, we did it. How much? You know, please, it's time to cut our losses. Now think about it from that incident. Macondo, Deepwater Horizon was an accident. It was not a cyber attack. Could it be a cyber attack? I've heard some people in industry say definitely yes. Some people in industry say definitely no. Let me sidestep that issue. Let's think about what and how it happened. And again, the recovery and the fact that because it was in federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico that came up on every state, you were regulated at that time by one federal agency. It was reorganized into 3 because there was a conflict of interest that at one time they're supposed to approve the safety and at the same time they're collecting license fees. So, you know, conflicting goals. Now it's into 3 federal agencies. Sidestepping that, you had the Coast Guard come in, you had all these different investigation agencies come in, recovery agencies, and then you had Texas, Louisiana, you know, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, all their state. So plus lawsuits under all of them. So BP smartly at one point said, we're cutting our losses and we're just settling. We got to cut this out. Otherwise, it had been predicted to go through 2020. So you go through the investigation. What happened? What systems were affected? What was compromised? Chagrin and BP, you know, you're going to be before Congress. I don't know if you remember the situation. They had Haywood, who was the chairman, the CEO at the time. He was a smart guy. He was a PhD. He was actually brought in because BP had such a poor safety record to instill more of a safety culture, but he wasn't very good at PR. And he sat before Congress at one point and said, I want my life back. To which the brother of one who was killed went public and said, I want my brother's life back. What a cavalier, cruel thing to say. You know, it was a PR thing. You need to manage this better. There were 11 people killed, right? So what happened? What systems are affected? What compromise? Who did it? Get your PR people. You've got to have a concerted story. Another mistake companies make, well, somebody will shoot their mouth off and say, well, I told that guy to update that software or something. One of the comments that came out during Target investigation was one of the operators in the big, you know, nerve center of the system room made a comment to the investigators and said, you know, we should have known something was up when all the servers rebooted at the same time. Yeah, you think, you know? So you go through this investigation process, you have multiple agencies, you have multiple missions again, you're having to deal with, you know, like go back to Macondo, the EPA, the environmental disaster, the effect of the long term. So this in itself is something else. And this is why if you are a cyber worker and you're in incident response or operations, either one, you're either trying to keep it operational or trying to figure out the attack and stop it, preserve evidence. Don't be that guy that deletes text and ends up losing a couple of years of his life. So I've got this. I've gone through it rather quickly. I've got one more video, and then we'll be through with incident response.